Hello everyone. I wanted to talk about in this recording how gross domestic product relates to gross domestic income. That is why you might have noted I cleverly labeled this particular module the title of an old Paul Simon song, "One man's ceiling is another man's floor." What that means is that the ceiling and floor is basically the same structure, but it is perceived differently depending on your viewpoint. If you live in the upstairs apartment, that structure is a floor. If you live in the downstairs apartment under it, that structure is a ceiling. So it's kind of the same way with gross domestic product and gross domestic income. By the way, I wanted to mention that we talked about the problems and the big pain in the rear end it is for the government to gather this huge amount of data, make estimates on it, and then have to revise their estimates when more data comes in. It's a big mess. And let me reassure you that figuring out gross domestic income is just as big a pain in the rear end as figuring out gross domestic product. So I would like to say that GD in both cases refers to gross domestic, not what you might be thinking otherwise if you're trying to numerically get your head around this stuff. Okay? So let's relate these things here. And first thing we'll do here is I wanted to reacquaint you then with that circular diagram that relates one part of the economy to the other, basically. On this side here we have households, and on this side we have firms. Now firms, of course, are the organization that make the stuff that we buy and use. And so the firms will produce and sell that stuff to the households, and that's basically production and sales. They're producing and selling. And to buy the stuff that the firms are producing, the households will pay for the items, basically consumption expenditures, okay? Expenditures, okay? Now, remember that the households own the stuff that the firms use to make their products, okay? So in that case, the firms will sell or allow the households will share in some way, sell, rent, or whatever, their inputs to the firm to make their production. And a big component of that, of course, is labor. And we have rents of natural resources, or I should say labor, production, natural resources that are on this, and other things, entrepreneurial ability, things like that provide the expertise and the implements the ingredients of production so that they can make their stuff. And so the firms, on the other hand, to use the stuff that they need to produce, they will make payments to the households. And the payments go in mainly in it is compensation, wages and benefits. I'll just put comp. Could be rents for use of the stuff if they do not own it while they use it. What else could it be? Interest income or interest for use of money perhaps, and profits for using entrepreneurial ability or management, something like that. And that could be stockholders. So, if you wanted to divvy this whole thing up, you might be able to say, not exactly, but more or less, that on this end, we have most of the stuff making GDP. It's the production and selling. And in the lower part of the diagram here, because the householders are selling their inputs to production and they're getting paid for it, you could call this the income part of it. And it's sort of the GDI part, whereas up here is the GDP part. So, and this is, the numbers aren't exact, but this is kind of how it goes, is that you would expect the figures to be fairly close, and they are, because the definition of gross domestic product is the value of all goods and services that are produced and consumed. It is the payment income that is derived from the production of the goods and services. Okay, so you'd expect it to be close. Well, since you hopefully are confused enough to understand the relationship between GDI and GDP, let's take a look at this, at a couple of the numbers here. And these numbers are from the fourth quarter of 2017, which is the most up-to-date figures I could really find, because they're still working their way through 2018. And that doesn't mean they're not working their way through 2017, but they've got a partial idea of it here. So, just for fun, let's put GDI, or excuse me, gross domestic product over here. Okay? And this is fourth quarter, 2017. Everything is in trillions of dollars. Okay? So, for GDP, as of the fourth quarter, GDP, gross domestic product, total was 18.75 trillion. Okay, 18.75 trillion. Okay, and then you have the components of it. Components. And the ones we have all come to know and love. We have consumption. And consumption is about 12.6 trillion. And that represents about 67% or 2/3. A little down from 70, but still the biggest amount. Okay, investment is, during the same time period, about 3.9 trillion. And that represents 18%. The government purchases is $3.10 trillion. And that is about, what, 17%? And net exports, and there's a reason why we have been doing a lot of trade deficits lately. Net exports, I'll say, is minus about 0.85. Okay, and that represents about a negative 4.5%. And that's what we have on the production side of it. Okay. So let's see how much time we have. First of all, we're doing pretty good. Okay. We might have to make one more tape here. Okay, on this side of the thing, we have GDI, gross domestic income, same time period. Total in trillions is 19.59. The components, I'll put parts just to be different, just to have less to write. Parts are compensation, that is benefits and wages. Incidentally, the benefits are a much bigger part of wages now, or compensation, than it was. It's up to over 30% now. So anyway, the compensation is about 10.48 trillion. 10.48, which represents, what am I doing here? 10.48 trillion, which represents about 53% of income. Profits are about 3.15 trillion, and that's about 16%. Rent's the smallest part of income, and that's for use by firms of things they don't own, basically. And that's 0.73. So that would be only $73 billion. So anyway, that is about 3.7%. And after that, we have net interest. Net interest is kind of a mess. It essentially is, in terms of GDP, or GDI, it's interest paid on the domestic front for domestic companies. It represents interest paid out in domestic transactions minus the interest that is received, plus the interest received from foreign transactions minus the interest paid out to foreign vendors. Confused? Yeah, that's about where you should be. I'm not exactly certain. I think it'd be a good idea to look up, maybe do even a paper on the origins of why they view it this way. But anyway, net interest with all that is 0.75, which is about 3.8%. Then we have a couple other things. We have taxes that are indirect. Now, indirect taxes are on consumption, are on production of things. They're any tax that isn't on income itself, okay? So indirect taxes on both production and exports, that's about 1.35 trillion. And that represents about 7%. And depreciation, which is the using up of things that no longer make other things, is about 3.13 trillion. And that's about 17%. Okay? Now, if you add all this stuff up, it will make 1959, but there is a statistical irregularity in counting this stuff that is less, that has been calculated in 2017 to be 0.84 trillion dollars. Now, if you take that off, GDI equals 1875 trillion. Okay? So they equal each other, or at least they come close. We'll have just one more little tape about some other measures we can use, and this just about does it. So thank you for your attention.